Good morning, everyone. So like Trevor said, my name is Dylan. I am not a fourth generation person here. I'm a first generation seed salesman and a third generation horticulturalist. So I just thought I'd give a quick, introduction of myself and who I am. I'm not just some Joe Schmo that showed up today. I promise Trevor doesn't hire people off the street like that. But anyway, so my name is Dylan Sedmak. I work for a company called PanAmerican Seed. PanAmerican Seed is a breeder of flowers, both annuals and perennials, and cut flowers. And we also breed vegetable varieties too. Vegetable varieties really targeted towards the home garden. So exactly what you guys are here for today. I got my degree in horticulture at Ohio State way back when. I am a Buckeye, I'm from Ohio. I spent some time as a grower, as a perennial grower out there in Ohio, and then worked actually for a number of years at the Scott's company before this, doing a lot of vegetable variety trials. So I got to really get my hands dirty trialing different varieties of vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, broccoli, etc., side by side. So it gave me a lot of firsthand experience with nailing down on varieties and some of the cultural characteristics as well. And then I've been with PanAmerican Seed for about a year and a half now. So that's about me. So then now I want to talk about what we're going to talk about today. So just a brief overview of what we're going to go through. So first I want to walk through planting time, because that's going to be the most important. We're in a very pivotal time for planting material in the garden. And then we're going to talk about site selection and some of the important characteristics of where and when to plant your crops. And then we'll be talking about best practices, culturally speaking. So practices in the garden that go a long way to ensuring a good harvest and strong, resilient plants. And then finally, I'm going to go through some variety recommendations. There's a huge list that Woldhuis has here of their 2024 vegetable offering. There's no way I could go through all 1,000 of them, I think. So I'll just go through just a few highlights, and then if you guys have questions at the end, feel free to ask me and come up to me later as well. All right, without further ado, so I mentioned that we're in a very pivotal time for planting vegetables, right? So we're at the end of March, beginning of April. So if you haven't already, I think now's a great time to talk about cool season crops. So you'll often hear these referred to as cool crops. Cool crops really refer to specifically your brassicas. So that's going to be your cauliflower, your broccoli, your kale, your Brussels sprouts. Those types of items, in addition to things like lettuce and even snap peas, are and some of your root crops as well, are great for planting at this time of the season. Generally speaking, we'll say you can plant those anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks before the frost-free date. That's a pretty generous timeline. Because those crops are adapted for the cold. Now, the important thing there is that if you do plant it early, just keep an eye on the weather. Make sure that it doesn't get below freezing. There's a couple crops that can handle it really cold, like cabbage, which can go down to 25 degrees. But a lot of those crops, they need to be hardened off, that is acclimated, before they go in the garden. So when you purchase them here from Woldhuis, just be really careful for that first week when you plant them, and cover them as needed if it's going to get very cold. But over time, they will acclimate and be able to take those temperatures. And in fact, it's actually a really good idea to plant your cool season crops early, because you're going to avoid a lot of issues with pests, with diseases. Your flavor is going to be better on your crops in general, and also you avoid issues with bolting. Bolting is basically when the plant goes to flower. A lot of these cool season crops cannot handle summer temperatures very well and will flower prematurely, which ruins the flavor and the harvest of the crop. So big key there is just planting those crops early. As far as the warm season material goes, so when I say warm season, I'm talking about our solanaceous crops. That's tomatoes, that's peppers, that's going to be our cucurbits, so cucumber, melon, squash, all those crops. You can plant before the last frost-free date. And in fact, you can be rewarded with earlier harvests and skirting by a lot of disease pressure that way. So usually what I say with those is plant those no earlier than 2 weeks before the frost-free date. You can plant a little bit earlier if you're a very aggressive gardener and willing to take out a comforter from your house and cover them on a cold night. But a lot of those crops really can't handle below 50 degrees. Yes, we have one here who's tucking their plants in at night. So 50 degrees is that key temperature. So those warm season crops, if it's going to get below 50 degrees, and it's before the last frost, that's when I would recommend covering them. Tomatoes are a little bit more forgiving, but when you get to, melons, cucumbers, basil, and peppers, those are very sensitive to the cold. And then in general, like I said, 2 weeks before that last frost. And then we see a lot of folks actually plant some later in the season as well. And of course, the benefit is that, like I said, you are going to be rewarded with earlier yields if you're willing to take on that risk. So as far as site selection goes, there's a lot of important considerations. And it really depends on what format you want to plant your crops in. And I'll get to that in a moment. But first, what I think is always really, really helpful is to have a plan in mind. So if you're going to plant in the ground, drawing a map out of your space and knowing what you're going to grow. If you're going to plant in a raised bed, exactly knowing, okay, here are the size of my plants. This is the spacing I'm going to need because of the size that they're going to grow to at maturity. And then, of course, in containers, if you like to do container gardening, which I'm really excited to talk about here in a bit, it's important to, of course, take into consideration what the size of your plants are going to be and where your containers are located around your house. In general, for all crops, I would highly, highly recommend, as much as you possibly can, plant in full sun. Do not plant in shade if you can help it, because shade causes a lot of issues. Not only will it reduce potential yield, but you actually can exacerbate disease pressure. Plants and moisture can stay on the plant's leaves for longer periods of time in those shady conditions. So full sun is really going to be best for full harvest and reducing disease pressure. And as I mentioned too, depending on where we're going to plant, it's really, really important to take into consideration the max size of that the plant's going to achieve. That may sound obvious to some, but it happens time and time again. I've seen expert and novice gardeners do it alike. They'll buy, a sweet little, sweet million little baby plant. And they're like, oh, that's great. I can plant this right next to my other sweet million, bring it right next to each other. And they grow into this gigantic heap of plants that's going to just be a disaster for disease and insect pressure in plant management as well. So really just make sure that when you buy those plants, take a look at the back of the tag, know what the max height is going to be and the max spread, and that's going to go a long way to ensuring proper plant health. So I mentioned the different planting formats we can have. And when I say formats, I really refer to three: in-ground, raised bed, and containers. And there's different plants that work for those three different formats. Now, I'm guessing that there's a good deal of us here who do sort of the traditional in-ground gardening. And in-ground gardening can be the most rewarding, but also sometimes the most challenging, as I'm sure many of us know. So they're most rewarding because now we have tons and tons of root space for these crops. So there's really no limit to how big these plants can get and to what their yield can be in regards to root space. The challenges come because now we're faced with limitations with our soil conditions, soil fertility, drainage, these really important characteristics that promote healthy plants. And in the Midwest, so like I said, I'm from Ohio, soil conditions are very similar. Usually we are faced with fairly heavy clay soils. So there's not always the greatest drainage. They hold on to nutrients fairly well, but the fact that they can stay waterlogged, or in the summer they can kind of cake and get really dry and hard to re-water, are serious challenges. So the biggest recommendation I have is that if you guys are going to be planting in ground, and you may have heard this already before, is adding organic matter. And really that's going to go miles and miles and miles to improving soil texture. Improving that soil texture is going to improve the drainage, so how well the water drains in the spring when it's wet, and how well it actually can be re-watered when it comes into the summer and we're going through drought conditions, that clay is starting to cake up. That organic matter is going to go a long way towards breaking up those undesirable characteristics. And of course, it's going to add a lot of fertility to the soil, which is going to be tremendous for your plants. So it can be compost, even just adding something simple like a peat moss. There's plenty of soil menders I'm sure they sell here at Wold Heights that you could look at. Those go a very, very long way towards improving in-ground conditions. Now, the other thing about in-ground I did want to mention is know what you planted last year. So pests and diseases are obviously a huge, huge issue with vegetable crops. We're basically planting the smorgasbord for wildlife to destroy, whether it's pathogens like fungi or bacteria, or insects as well. And those diseases, those pathogens, those insects, I like to kind of stay where they think their environment's favorable, where they're going to have food the next season. So for example, what I always recommend is rotating your crops if possible, at least within the space of the garden. And at a minimum, for maintaining proper root health. And so I'll give you an example. If you have 4 corners of a square, and this is your in-ground garden, and, one quarter was your tomatoes and peppers and potatoes one year, and another corner was cucumbers, and the other 2 were something else. Rotating out those different types of crops is going to go a long way. So rotating out your tomatoes, peppers, and potatoes, where your melons were the previous year, and vice versa, will go a long way towards reducing pathogen pressure on that crop from the previous year. Because if you plant the tomato in the same place year after year after year, you're basically allowing it to sit and whatever, we'll say, kind of filth rubbed off from the previous season in regards to not only disease and pathogens, but a lot of insects as well, which will overwinter in the soil. So really, really important in ground to rotate your plantings within that space. So the next format I wanted to mention was raised beds. And raised beds are, to me, kind of a nice sweet spot. Now, they take more investment, right? You've got to take the time to build a bed or buy the bed. You've got to fill it with a lot of soil. But to me, they're a nice sweet spot because now what you have is a space that is big enough to grow large plants, but you have what I call like this artificial soil. And because you're not filling it with in-ground native soil. You're filling it with a raised bed soil, which is a constructed soil. It has excellent drainage characteristics, excellent nutrient holding capacity, excellent water holding capacity. It's a very nice mix of all these. But like I said, it requires all this sort of overhead investment in the project. But you can grow some really, really nice plants in raised beds. They're also, of course, very ergonomic, I think. It's easy to sit on the side of a bed and do all the work you need to do and maintenance for that. So raised beds are really nice. The one consideration is that there's some varieties you're, of course, not going to be able to grow in that raised bed, right? So if we're growing maybe a sweet million or vining cucumbers or winter squash in ground, we can't always take those to a raised bed because a lot of those are 8x4s, somewhere around there. The larger the plant you get, the more space limitations you have and where you can put it. So raised bed, I say, is that sweet spot for some of these determinants or semi-determinants when it comes to tomatoes. Lots of peppers fit well in raised beds. There's some bush-type cucurbits, bush-type cucumbers that work well in raised beds. So you do kind of reduce your variety availability, but you do increase success rate tremendously. The other thing about raised beds too is that if you do use raised beds, you can have similar issues that I just mentioned at in-ground. So that's the retaining of potential diseases and pests. I don't see it as much anecdotally versus an in-ground setting, but it is an important consideration. So if you have 2 raised beds or more than one, it might be helpful to rotate those 2. And of course, periodically, I'd say several years, I've gone several years without replacing raised bed media and just topping it off year to year and adding some organic matter or slow release fertilizer. And then the last format I want to talk about was containers. And this has been a really growing trend in gardening I've seen over the last several years, even since before COVID. And the big thing here is that there's less homeowners nowadays than there were in the past. There's more people living in urban areas or metropolitan areas. So even a company like us, PanAmerican, who breeds vegetables, we have excellent indeterminate or large varieties, but we've actually been breeding for a lot of compact varieties because we've seen a demand for it for this container type gardening. And me, I have a lot of space in my home. I have a lot of in-ground space, but I still really, really like container gardening because it offers, to me, a combination of several things. One is that it's super, super simple. You don't need to invest in a large raised bed and tons of raised bed media. So you have easier inputs, right, capital investment into the project. It's almost surefire in regards to soil quality because you're basically replacing the soil every year, right, with a potting media. So you never have to worry about disease pressure or soil quality or any of the other things I mentioned where you retain the growing media year after year. And then the other thing too is that actually it's kind of fun, it's kind of ornamental. There's a lot of vegetable varieties out there now that you can use, I think, ornamentally, and having them next to your patio or close to the home is a really great way, I think, to not only have something edible, but just to bring plants in closer to the home. That's not just a flower, or you could plant them with a flower, which we've seen as well. So containers, to me, are a growing trend. There's a lot of really cool varieties, including those that they sell here at Wold Heights, which I'll mention later. which I think are awesome options for the home gardener that are really, really easy. And I would say that if any of you are brand new to gardening and are nervous about getting into it and nervous about the process of investing time and labor into a project, I think container gardening is like a really, really easy way to get started into the process. It's and even if you're an experienced gardener, I think it's a nice way to switch it up and have a different experience. The last thing too, I just want to mention, when you do choose your site, if it's going to be in-ground or a raised bed, of course, a couple other considerations: access to water. Just make sure that you're close to a water source. You can get a hose out there, whatever you need, because you will be probably watering a decent bit when you transplant these crops and during drought periods in the summer. And then, of course, there are some plants you don't want to plant around. The big one being that I think we see in a decent amount of yards is black walnut. Black walnut is allelopathic. It releases toxins through its roots. If you have black walnut, do not plant anywhere close to that tree because it will greatly diminish the quality of your plants. So now I'm going to get into cultural practices. So this is sort of the nitty-gritty of how to grow some of these plants. I'll just briefly mention planting depth because this is a question I get a lot. It's really going to vary on crop. You know, there's some crops that you can plant high, like above the seed leaves or above the first true leaves. The two plants in general that root easily outside of their stems, it's called adventitious rooting when they do that, when they root in a place they don't normally root, would be tomatoes. And then a lot of cucurbits, so melons, cucumbers, squash, those will root outside the stems. So you can plant them a little deeper. Tomatoes, frankly, you can plant, we've taken transplants and buried them halfway through and they'll root out the sides. And sometimes you'll see that on the stems. On the stems, you'll see these white little nubs hanging in the air and you might think, oh, what is that? Is that a disease? It's actually little root nodules. And then, like I said, squash, melon, cucumber, these cucurbit type crops also will root adventitiously outside the base of their stem. So those ones you can plant a little deeper as well if you need to. A lot of these other crops, whether it be pepper or anything else, I really don't recommend planting deep. You really shouldn't need to unless they're really, really leggy and stretchy. I usually don't plant beyond the first set of true leaves just to avoid potential disease issues, and they don't really root as easily, if at all, through that depth. So that was just planting depth. And then I want to talk about water, because water, of course, is super, super critical for plants, and how we do it is really important. And even in, what's interesting is even in the horticulture industry, so all the people behind the scenes who grow all these plants, watering is actually one of the hottest button issues when it comes to how to properly grow the plant. Not just keeping it, between keeping it too dry and too wet, but also when to water. So first, I actually just want to talk about when to water. Water, obviously, the plants need, but doing it at the right time of the day is super, super important. And really the bottom line is if you have to water a plant, and this isn't always possible because we've got work, we've got family, etc., but really water at the beginning of the day. And that's going to go a long way to making sure that the plant doesn't not only face drought stress throughout the day, but also will prevent a ton of disease issues that you can see if you water in the evening or at night. Because if that plant goes into the night with moist foliage, that's just asking for bacteria, for fungi to invade the leaves of that plant. So it goes a long way to water at the beginning of the day if you can. Of course, if you do sub-irrigation or you're just watering the ground, it's less of an issue, but still reducing moisture around the plant in general, reducing humidity before you go into the night is gonna go a long, long way. So that's when to water. And now there's always a question of how to water and how often. And how often is really going to vary based on the weather and based on where you're planting too. So I'll give you an example. When we first transplant these crops, the biggest goal is to get them rooted into the ground. Now, most of what we're planting are very, very happy to root into the ground. They're very, very quick rooters, so we don't need to water them a ton. They will rapidly root into those containers or into the raised bed or into the ground, and it might be just a weekly maintenance watering, especially the time in which we're planting these, which is usually spring, whether it's early spring, mid-spring, or even towards the end of May. It's a rainy season for the most part, so I think that usually when we're planting, watering is not as much of an issue as we think it is. And for me, it's really kind of on an as-needed basis, and watering maybe just once a week as a maintenance. Once they get established, that's where it can get a little bit more dependent on the weather even more, right? Because I know that, in Ohio last June, it got very, very dry. June's not typically the driest month of the year, but Ohio, the last 2 Junes have been unseasonably dry, where we've had drought-like conditions. Those types of weeks, I'm out there watering at least twice a week for stuff that's in the ground, in containers even more. So when you go from in-ground to raised bed to containers, that's the spectrum on what you're gonna water. So you're gonna water the least in-ground because there's a larger water reservoir. In raised beds, you're gonna water more often. In containers, you're gonna be watering frequently. The last thing too on watering, especially with tomato and pepper crops. So not going too dry and not going too wet are very, very important for those 2 crops in particular, because we actually see issues with what's called blossom end rot. Blossom end rot actually is a physiological disorder that happens when calcium can't be transported properly to the fruits. And that happens if the plant is being kept too wet and there's not enough calcium moving up with the water because it doesn't take up any water, or if it's being kept too dry for the same reason. It's not taking up enough water, it's not taking up enough calcium. So with tomatoes and peppers in particular, repeated drought stress or keeping them inundated is really, really unideal. And you will get this blossom end rot, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. You'll get the end of these fruits and they'll just turn kind of brown to black. And you can still eat around them, but often what it does is not only reduces the appearance and quality of the fruit, but can introduce other rot pathogens into the fruit, and you'll have to discard the whole fruit. So with those 2 crops in particular, I always advise be extra vigilant on maintaining sort of even moisture where you can. I did want to mention fertility. So fertility also super important. If we can keep our plants healthy, we're going to reduce a lot of issues down the road with pests and pathogens. So fertility, people do this differently, but my bias has always been using a slow release form of fertilizer. And for me, the reason being is there's a couple. One, to me, it's easy. I don't have to remember to go out there and use my liquid feed. Liquid feed is very effective, but it's momentary. But I can go ahead and put on, let's say, some slow release Osmocote or Nutricote or whatever I'm using in the garden, maybe twice throughout the season when I plant, and maybe a boost later in the summer, and that's all I have to do. And then I can walk away and not have to worry about fertilizer. Same thing applies to, of course, organic matter. Hot compost essentially works as a slow release fertilizer. And the double duty it does there is that if you're applying it to in-ground situations or raised beds, it's also improving the soil quality over time as it degrades into that soil. So slow release, I'm a big fan of. You can use liquid feed. A lot of people do. I think especially in like container settings, it can be pretty helpful where you have a limited soil volume. But like I said, it's more of an acute or momentary benefit to the plant, and if you choose to just go a liquid feed route, you're going to be doing that regularly. In fact, it's up to you to do that regularly, or else the plant will decline. So having a slow release in there, at least as a baseline, is really important. And if you feel like you need to give it extra juice because that slow release is releasing a little bit too slow, you can go ahead with the liquid feed. But that baseline of either compost or a granular fertilizer is going to be super, super advantageous for you guys. Next, I will mention the disease and pest pressure, because we are planting this smorgasbord for nature to destroy. And there's tons of stuff out there to destroy it too. I mentioned it earlier, but I think a really, really important part of realizing what can make our plants stand up against disease and pest pressure is keeping as healthy of a plant as possible. If the baseline of the plant is healthy, so if it's been fertilized, it's adequately watered, it's getting good sun, you start with a really beefy plant that's actually less susceptible to disease and pest pressure. And what we found is that when plants are sick or when plants are not at their best because they're not being fertilized properly, they actually are more attractive to these pests and diseases, and actually don't stand up as well against their attacks as well. So that baseline of keeping a healthy plant goes miles towards preventing a lot of those issues. But beyond that, there's a lot more that goes into it, right? I mentioned it a little bit ago, but site selection. So making sure that we're planting in the sun and not planting in the shade to avoid certain pathogen issues, like especially powdery mildew, but also proper spacing. So generally what we want to avoid, and it's not always 100% possible, but as much as we can, know what the max spread is of your plant, and make sure that, by the time they reach maturity, that ideally not touching too much whatever their neighbor is, especially if they're the same type of plant. Like if you've got two indeterminate tomatoes and you know they're gonna grow big, give them enough space at the get-go, and it's gonna look like a lot of space depending on the crop, to make sure that they're not touching too much later on. And really what happens is that when you get that contact with these plants, we start creating these microenvironments. These microenvironments have high humidity, they've got low airflow, they've got lots and lots of foliage, and what that creates is just this platter for fungi, for some bacteria as well, to proliferate in. And it's also really hard to notice, because you're not going in there and looking through all the leaves on a regular basis in this crowded garden setting. So proper spacing will also go a super, super long way towards preventing disease and pest pressure. The other thing too is in regards to moisture management. I mentioned those already, but I'll just recap on them. One is that we're watering in the morning, not at night. And the other is in regards to root health. We're not overwatering the plant. I've seen a lot of plants die, particularly house plants, as seems to be the trend, from too much love. So we want to keep our plants alive. We want to, make sure that they're okay. Oh, do they need more water? And, I have always advised, and even in the horticulture industry, so what goes on behind the scenes, so what you see above you, what goes into these products, watering on the dry side where possible. There's some caveats, of course, with tomatoes and peppers that I mentioned, but in general, overwatering plants is going to cause a lot more issues in regards to disease than underwatering. And we're going to get root rot pathogens, and those pathogens will proliferate on the roots. They'll end up killing the plant or declining it, and then those pathogens are going to stay in the soil for the next year. So just make sure that you don't overlove your plants with water. I always get a lot of questions, and I don't really want to go into it now because there's a lot of different answers depending on what your goal is, but there's always a question on pesticide usage. Should I use pesticides? In general, I think it's kind of more of a philosophical thing. Of course, we may use pesticides in the greenhouse on flowers or something, but when it comes to in the garden, me personally, I say that if I'm going to keep the plant healthy, I'm going to space it properly. I'm not going to plant it in the same space that the same crop was last year. I've done my part, and I'm not going to bother with the extra, not even just the concerns of is it going to be effective, but the extra work of going out there and spraying pesticides, even if they're biological pesticides. Me, I like to garden, but I'm lazy when it comes to having to do all the maintenance stuff. I will fertilize, I will water, but it's just too much extra work for me, but you can do it, and I can give you recommendations if you want to ask later on. But doing those steps I mentioned is going to go a long way towards preventing disease pressure in the first place and insect pressure. There's some pests that you just can't help but see every year. I think we all know, tobacco hornworm, our squash vine borers. Those things are serious pests that we can, there's some tips and tricks to avoid those or just to control them. But the other thing too is also beyond doing the right cultural regimen I mentioned, there's a lot of disease-resistant varieties out there. And some of the varieties I'm going to mention today on my top picks have a pretty good disease resistance portfolio. And it's something that as breeders, we've really focused a lot on to make sure that our varieties can have bacterial leaf spot resistance or powdery mildew resistance, these diseases that show up year and year after the garden. So right varieties, right place, and right plant health are going to go a long way towards disease and pest pressure. Save a couple nasty insects like the borer. I did want to mention too in regards to site selection support structures. So this is also going to be dependent on the crop. So I'll talk about peppers quickly. Peppers, super simple. Just throw a stake on them is usually what I recommend. Point being is that their fruit gets top heavy, they might bend over and the stem can crack later on. So when you plant them, it's just easiest to do when you plant them. Just stake them along the main stem, and then you can, as needed, tie more bands or straps or whatever you're using along the stem and the stake support as it grows. So pepper is pretty simple, straightforward, just a stake is what I recommend. On tomatoes, this is the one where it can get a little not complicated, but it'll vary based on the type of tomato you're working with. And I'll talk about the different types later. But with tomatoes, generally the most common practice, of course, is caging them, right? we know what tomato cages are. You plant them on when you transplant your crop. It's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of varieties now, these more compact varieties I'll mention, where it's actually not even really necessary to cage them anymore. And for me, I think that makes them easier to work with. It makes them easier to monitor for pests and diseases. It makes them easier to harvest as well. And you can just throw a stake on those like you would a pepper. And those are gonna be your determinate and compact types. And then as far as cucurbits go, so when I say cucurbits, those melons, cucumbers, etc., the big thing is that those are these large vining plants, and a lot of people just kind of let them run rampant, which you can. But a big thing too is watch where the fruits are, because where the fruits are, if you want to get, say, straight pickling cucumber, and your cucumber plant is vining all around the place and the fruits are, sitting like this, they're gonna come out crooked. So a big thing is with those melons and kind of ground running plants that you're watching where their fruit lands. If you don't want misshapen fruit, that can happen. I have seen people actually grow cucumbers and more of the bush types in cages. So they will use cages, and then a lot of those will actually send out tendrils along the leaf nodes that'll grab onto the cages, climb up, and actually is a really clever way to contain your plant, especially for these more compact types. And it's actually kind of ornamental as well. Of course, when it comes to our beans, so these are running plants, there's usually two different broad categories of beans, right? So we have our bush types, which generally don't need support, if any. And then we have our runners, our pole beans. Pole beans are crazy aggressive. I always say put up a trellis, put up a lattice, put up something where you're comfortable with them taking that over, because they will take it over. It will become a wall of leaves and beans. So those always use the support. I never let them run on the ground either, just to make sure that you can not only easily harvest them, but that the beans themselves don't rot or have issues. I also get questions on pruning sometimes. And pruning on vegetables, I personally don't do. You can. The big ones where I will see it on, I would say the biggest one I actually see it on and get questions on are tomatoes. And some people do prune tomatoes. This will help potentially reduce some of that disease pressure I mentioned by clearing out the canopy. It's kind of like pruning a tree. You're clearing out the inside of the canopy. Sorry about that. But I've actually also seen people use it to train their tomatoes up certain support structures. So I've seen people espalier their tomatoes like you would an apple tree, where you are training it up against a lattice wall, and you are, having these selective branches go off to the side, weaving them through to create this beautiful masterpiece of a tomato that also is functional as well, and usually get a pretty good yield out of it in good sized fruit, because you have less branches and more nutrients going to those fruit. Some people will also prune their cucurbits, their melons, cucumbers, just to kind of clear out that mess and maybe get a bigger fruit. That's usually the trade-off, right? You're gonna get less fruit, but you get bigger fruit, and then also you can reduce some of the disease pressure issues down the road. But generally, me personally, I don't prune my crops. The last thing I wanted to mention too, before I get into some of the variety options, is gonna just be preventing weeds. So weeds are, I know everyone hates to pull weeds. I actually kind of like pulling weeds. It's cathartic for me. But with weeds, just remember, each weed that's in there not only is stealing nutrients from your plant, but if it sets seed, the things that we call weeds set hundreds, if not thousands of seeds. Just one plant. And those thousands of seeds are 1,000 more plants, and it's gonna multiply exponentially. So I am like torched earth with my weeds. I go ahead and I pull them, and if I see them flowering, I pull them right away. So I'm very, very obsessive about them, and you should be too, especially when it comes to vegetable crops, because guess what? We're not just growing a pretty flower, we're growing something that we want to eat. And in agriculture, for example, they are religious about weeds, because every weed that you have is going to reduce the yield and the quality of your plant, and it's going to be a host to pests and diseases. Pests will use those weeds as a refuge before they go and attack your plants. And they'll be a host for diseases as well for the same reason. So not only keeping on top of weeds, but there's a couple methods you can do. Really one primary method I recommend as a preventative, and I was talking about it with a couple of folks up front earlier, and that's just using mulch. Mulch goes a super long way. If it's in-ground or raised bed in particular, where you're not replacing that soil annually, mulch is gonna be super, super helpful. It can be anything from just a traditional bark mulch to throwing on a new layer of compost. A new layer of compost or organic matter will essentially suffocate a lot of new seedling emergence the following season. You still have to pull some. And then I've actually seen a lot of growers, you have to be careful with this one, but they'll use, it's like a landscape fabric mulch. And that's something that I always caution if you're gonna do that, either replace it annually or make sure that you are working that soil underneath, especially if it's in ground. But that is like, nothing's gonna grow through it. So that's the benefit. They're water permeable. You can cut holes in them. It takes more time to lay out, but you're never ever gonna get weeds in between your plants. It's actually a very clean look too, but it's, you have to make sure that you're amending the soil and taking care of the soil underneath and not just leaving it on year after year. So yes, weeding and then mulching, super, super important. And then mulching is gonna save you time too. It's also actually gonna help preserve moisture in the soil, so that'll really help combat some of the highs and lows of watering that I mentioned earlier. I think without further ado, I figured I'd just end the presentation talking through some top varieties. And before I kind of talk about top varieties, just a few things to consider before you choose what varieties you want to grow. So of course, space is going to be the biggest one. Know where you're going to grow. Are you going to grow in ground, in a raised bed, in a container? Because that's going to dictate the size of the plant you're going to want to buy, of course. When you want to harvest, always make sure you're looking at the time to maturity for these crops. The time to maturity is going to fluctuate a little bit depending on the season, depending on your growing conditions, and depending on when you plant it as well. And you can plant multiple rotations of these crops to get multiple harvests throughout the summer, so keep that in mind. And then flavor as well, because there's some varieties that have been bred for excellent disease resistance, excellent characteristics that aren't even applicable to the homeowner, but their flavor is really, really bad. It's true. So actually, what's interesting, I'll share something interesting with you from the horticulture industry, or the agronomic industry, rather, and it's that breeders breed for a long shelf life on fruit, something that doesn't even apply to us, right, as someone who wants to eat the fruit and have something tasty. So they'll breed for what's called LSL varieties, have got the longest shelf life. You can ship them from here to China and they'll just stand up great, but they're not gonna taste great. So that's always been interesting to me, looking behind the scenes on our produce breeding. And I will say that Wold-Heiss has a very nice selection in general, and it looks like to me that they've really narrowed it down. I'm looking at the 2024 list now. So I'm guessing they have most of these on the shelf now. If not, I'm sure they'll have them later in the season. But just a couple cole crops I wanted to mention. I am a sucker for broccoli. I love broccoli, personally, just eating it and then growing it. It's pretty fun and rewarding too. I always see if I can, like, how big can I get my head of broccoli every year? And I don't think there's any county fair competition for broccoli we have, but if there was, I would enter it. Broccoli, I will say too, really fun one to grow in containers. I know you can grow these awesome heads in ground, but I love just having a nice big broccoli plant in the early spring. Their leaves are actually quite ornamental. They're kind of, you know, this like light green color, and the texture is very soft. And just watching that head come up on your patio, I don't know, I really like it. So enough about nerding about broccoli, but the two varieties that they do carry are going to be Marathon and Pac-Man. So Marathon is a really, really good variety for for spring. That's the one I would definitely recommend planting now. It's gonna have a pretty early yield, bred for these cool conditions, so it's less of that, if we do have a really thick cold snap, it's one of those varieties that we're not gonna have to worry about as much. The other variety they do carry is a pretty good contender for fall, or if you're bold enough to just do a summer planting of broccoli in general, and that's gonna be Pac-Man. So the other cold crop I wanted to mention too was cabbage. Cabbage is a really, really nice one if you're just getting into cool season planting for the first time. It can handle really, really cold temperatures, down to 25 degrees, so below freezing. And they have a very, very quick variety here. It's called Fast Vantage. I'm always a big fan of what can I get the earliest, because it also means not only can you get that one harvest, but you can plant multiple rotations of that and get multiple yields throughout the season. So going on to some of the warm season options, I'm also a huge sucker for cantaloupe. I love the flavor. I can actually eat a whole cantaloupe in one sitting. I haven't tried two, but I bet I could do two as well. Yeah, I'm a savage with cantaloupe. But one variety I've really liked, and I had the pleasure of growing this one many times, is Aphrodite. Aphrodite has a very large fruit. I don't remember exactly how many ounces. It's more like pounds. But it is a big fruit, like bigger than my head, generally, if it's grown in good conditions, and the flavor is really exceptional. So I've always really liked Aphrodite. The other one they carry is Hale's Best, which is an oldie, and it can be a goldie. Hale's Best produces these they basically look like a football type melon. They are a cantaloupe essentially, and they produce tons and tons of them. Sometimes the fruit quality can be hit or miss depending, because they don't hold on the vine super well. So you have to really harvest them at the right time, but they produce tons of fruit. So there's those two, Aphrodite and Hale's Best. And you know why one's good and the other's good as well. Another really cool plant, that's cucurbit. So in that family with melons and cucumbers, I keep on saying. If you haven't tried it, try it. It is awesome. It's called Cucamelon. So call it Mexican Gherkin. And this plant, it has these small leaves. They're about this big. They look like miniature cucumber leaves. And the stems are very thin, thinner than a bean stem. And they will climb over anything. So I really recommend having a support for it. And they'll just create this beautiful wall. But be careful what you plant them next to, because they will climb over that too. So again, site selection, super important. But they produce these little fruits, thousands. It's insane how many they produce. These little fruits, they're about this big, about the size of a thimble, and they look like a watermelon, a miniature watermelon. And they taste, and you can eat them whole, the skin and everything, and they taste like a cucumber with a citrus tart, like not super tart, but just like a little citrus kick. Like someone put a little citrus in the fruit. And they're adorable too. I mean, they look like melons, watermelons for dolls, I'm not even kidding. So, really cool plant. Mexican Gherkin, or also called Cucamelon as well. I was really happy to see that. Oh, they have it here. Yeah, the sour Cucamelon, yes. Cucamelon sour gherkin, yes. Okay, also on the cucumbers, I did want to mention bush crop. So this is a nice one. It's 55 days to maturity. And when you guys buy it, you're pretty much already shaving off at least a week or so from that. So it's going to be pretty quick to harvest. And I'm always a really big proponent of these bush type cucumbers, just because they take up less space. The smaller plants tend to have, I think, less disease issues, culturally speaking. Not that they have resistance spread into them per se, but it's more so that when you have, a smaller plant and not this gigantic vine that's spreading throughout your garden, it's easier to keep track of pests and diseases. There's less opportunity for these pests and diseases to come in. It's much more modular. You can put it in a raised bed or in the in-ground. So I'm always a big fan of these sort of intermediate to compact varieties. So that is the bush crop cucumber. The other one I wanted to mention too on the pickling side, there's Wisconsin SMR 58. It looks like they're listing it as SMR 58. So this was bred at Wisconsin State, but a really nice pickling type if you like to pickle. It has a good disease resistance package as well. Super important for those cucumbers. And then also peppers. I'm a big pepper fan, and they have a huge list of peppers and tomatoes, and I cannot go through the whole list. So I'm just gonna pick literally just several. And then if you guys want to know more of my favorites, you can ask me after. But I figured these are good like catch-all varieties for the general audience. Belle type, I chose the Better Belle 4. So Better Belle 4 is going to be a Belle. It's going to go from green to red, 75 days to maturity, has a good disease resistance package of tobacco mosaic virus and bacterial leaf spot, which are two things that we see not only in the greenhouse and agriculture, but also at the homeowner level as well. So that is the Better Belle 4. And then another really interesting variety I wanted to mention is the Cajun Belle, which is going to be a hot pepper. I don't know the Scoville or heat unit off the top of my head, but it's probably around a mild to medium jalapeno depending on how you grow it. And just in case, fun fact, in case you guys weren't aware of this, with hot peppers, the heat level will change based on growing conditions. And generally under more stressful conditions, the heat level, or what's sometimes called the Scoville heat units, will go up on a pepper, especially droughty conditions. The heat can increase on those peppers. So if you notice fluctuations in the heat levels and you're a hot pepper person, from year to year, that can actually be why. But anyways, the Cajun Belle is really cool. So they've got these kind of what we call a midi Belle. So it's not a miniature, but it's not a large Belle. And they're about this big, and they mature to this bright red color, and there's tons of them. So usually these large bell peppers, you get this really great quality fruit, but you don't get a lot from one plant. So you have to plant quite a bit. With these Cajun Belles, you just get tons. So you get dozens of fruit off of one plant, and they're pretty early to mature as well. They're mildly hot, so you have to keep that in mind. But that's just something different I've really liked, and you can use it in place of a jalapeno. They've got a little bit of a sweet pepper taste, but with some heat on it as well. And that is the Cajun Belle. Pretty early too, so 60 to 65 days. Another one I would also recommend, and this is kind of a classic as well, is Gypsy. So Gypsy is a sweet pepper, and this is a 65-dayer, but it's also got a good disease resistance package and actually matures through several colors. So for me, I really like using it as an ornamental as well. And speaking of ornamentals and peppers, peppers are one of those crops that I think the majority of varieties, there's some outliers that are extra big, some of the super hots and habaneros, but the majority of pepper varieties, I feel comfortable saying that you can grow those in like a large patio container. It's not going to be like an indeterminate tomato that's going to get huge. Save a couple super hots and habaneros. So I always like something with the peppers that's a little ornamental. You've got fruit that transitions to these colors, very beautiful, and early to harvest and good disease resistance package. Another one I like too, which is, I think this is maybe an heirloom, I can't remember if it's a hybrid or not, apologies, is Jimmy Nardello. Jimmy Nardello, I actually discovered by accident. Someone like once sent me the seed and I said, I don't know, I mean, we'll see, what's up with the name? And I planted it, and it was really, really cool. So they've got these long red, they're probably like, get up to 6 inches long, red sweet peppers that are perfect for frying. The wall of the pepper, so the flesh, is about medium size. It's not as thick as a Belle, but it has really, really good flavor. It's not the sweetest, but the flavor is really rich. And I actually fried it up with spaghetti squash, and it was like super good. So Jimmy Nardello, I've always really liked for the flavor, and you get a good amount of fruit off of it as well. Jalapenos, people always ask about jalapenos. There's tons. Some people have their favorites. I recommended La Bomba too. It's pretty early, so 65 to 70 days. And then again, going back to disease resistance, it has a bacterial leaf spot and tobacco mosaic virus resistance to really important diseases that we see in the garden. I did want to call out this strawberry. I didn't talk about strawberries earlier. Strawberries are what I call almost a year-round crop in regards to, they're both kind of a cool season and a warm season. Frankly, they're actually a perennial. So you can plant them in the spring, they'll take the cool temperatures. The big thing with strawberries, I'll briefly mention, is that if you're not familiar, there are these two types, right, that we generally talk about. That's the Everbearing and June-bearing. As the name implies, June is gonna really yield most of their yield in June, Everbearing throughout an indeterminate amount of time. June bearings usually have a very high yield, but it's in that window, whereas Everbearing is, it's more sporadic, but they will have throughout the season. But I did want to mention this variety because I have been just really impressed by this. It's called Delizz. It's Everbearing, and it's Delizz. And so I got to trial this way back when. And this variety is it's a blockbuster for yield, and then the size of the fruit and the flavor. Because what I've noticed is a lot of the varieties that we grow in the garden nowadays, they come from, they're these varieties that they also use in field production. They're good, but sometimes the fruit can be variable in size and then also flavor. I think flavor for a strawberry is so important. And Delizz has been one that's always combined a good fruit size, a good yield, and also really, really good flavor. It's one that I can never save because I'm always eating the fruit off the plant. It does spread too. So some strawberries are more bush type, some will spread more. Delizz, keep in mind, it does have these runners that go around, so be prepared for that. But another fun one to try in containers, if you guys ever so feel the urge to do more container gardening, Okay, tomatoes, again, like just a massive list, and I'm only gonna mention a few from different categories that I've had trial experience with and I've really liked. Quick note on tomatoes, so we kind of divide these into two classes, generally determinate and indeterminate. Determinate being that they have a determinate set of fruit. So their fruit set is usually more at a concentrated window, let's say over the course of several weeks, whereas an indeterminate will flower and fruit throughout the season, frost until frost. Usually combined with this, but not always, but usually, is that the determinate types will be a little bit more compact, generally compact, whereas the indeterminate types will just keep on growing and be sprawling and will be huge. There's pros and cons, as you can imagine. The indeterminate types you get tons of yield out of, but they are can generally be garden monsters. The determinate types, of course, maybe not as much yield, but much more manageable in the garden because they're more compact. So I did want to mention one of my favorite beefsteaks. Beefsteaks are always I feel like a contentious subject amongst tomatoes because everyone's got their favorite. There's so many heirloom types or these varieties that have been around for decades. And some people even have their own family heirlooms that they won't share with anyone else, and they love those as well, and go for it, more power to you. But one that I've really always been impressed with is Big Beef. And so Big Beef's a classic. It's an AAS winner from the 90s, but it's early yielding for a beefsteak. It has good disease resistance. And the one thing I've been really impressed with beyond the yield is that it has very, very little caul. And when I say caul, I mean fruit that you're gonna throw away. And one thing with beefsteaks that you'll see is they're one of the last tomatoes to mature in the garden. And they take forever to mature. They're one of the last things to harvest. And then you get to harvest them, and you have to be there at just the right minute, because sometimes, especially if it's a wet year, they'll start cracking, they'll start splitting, and then they're just a disgusting mess. Everything smells like nasty trash. It can just be super gross. But Big Beef has been one I've been impressed with because we always got excellent yields off of it. Very, very little caul, very little few nasty tomatoes. It's not going to be the biggest beefsteak in the world, but it is a beefsteak. When you see it, you know that's a beefsteak. So yes, definitely recommend Big Beef. Going on to more of the globe types. So this is going to be, beefsteak is your largest. It's going to be your latest maturing, generally speaking. I go to the next category, which is your globes, which is your traditional just round tomato, 4 to 6 ounces or what have you. There's a lot to choose from. The Bush Early Girl. So Early Girl has always been a favorite of mine just for the early yield, as the name implies. Usually 50 to 55 days, which is pretty obscene for a tomato to yield in that short amount of time. So I've always liked Early Girl. And then the Bush type, of course, I personally like for the more compact habit. I don't think you can go wrong with either. If I were to put both of them side by side, I think Early Girl is a little superior. But Bush Early Girl, if you have less space, is an alternative as well. Another big one, which if you guys have grown tomatoes already, I'm sure you've heard of, is Celebrity. Celebrity has always been a fan favorite. It is an AAS winner, excellent flavor, excellent yield, and a good, really strong disease resistance package as well. So Celebrity is one that you really can't go wrong with in most parts of the country from the globe types. Husky Cherry Red is another one I've really liked. So this is going to be a more determinate type. So it's more compact, as the name implies, husky. And it does look like a husky plant. The foliage itself is darker green and more corrugated. It just looks beefy. And it's 65 days to harvest. Good flavor. That if you ever want to play around with the container gardening idea I mentioned, this is a really nice one for that. Or a corner of a raised bed. Another really cool one, this is a globe type. It's just really beautiful fruit, and the fruit's really meaty and juicy. It's called Mr. Stripey, and this has been around for a bit. So it's this kind of golden orange color that has this sort of orangish, it's like an orange-red blush stripes on it. So, and when you cut into it, it retains that color, so you can see that marbling on the inside. It not only looks really cool, but the flavor is really, really nice. It's a meatier tomato. It's got a good amount of flesh, not too watery. So that's a really cool one. And I know kids really like the color in that one. And then the other one that I've grown a lot of is Patio. Patio is going to be a globe type. It's a determinate. So it's basically, what I like to say is it's like the Husky Cherry, but for globe tomatoes. So it's a little bit more compact. The fruits are on the smaller end for a globe. But again, I just mentioned it that if you're lacking for space, that's a good one to look at. This is a classic as well, but Roma's, so the paste type tomatoes, San Marzano. San Marzano's been around for a long time, but it's, you know, in the trials I've seen, it's always been a solid performer. Really, really thick flesh, solid flavor, excellent for canning or making sauce if you want to. And they still have a disease resistance package on the variety as well, which is good. On the larger cherries, there's two in particular I always like to call out. Sun Sugar, if you haven't tried it, is like, to me, one of the best tasting cherry tomatoes. They're like a gold type, and they produce tons and tons of fruit. You'll get some splitting on some, but you just get so much fruit it doesn't even matter, and you can still eat the split ones. But the flavor is perfect. The skin's not too tough, and for me on cherry tomatoes, that's always really important. So Sun Sugar is one I've always really liked for flavor and eatability right off the vine. And then Sweet Million is also one you can't go wrong with. It's similar. I mean, it's an indeterminate red cherry tomato. It's gonna get really big in the garden. I think the skin's a little thicker than a Sun Sugar, but the flavor is a little bit more savory than sweet. So yeah, those are my tomato recommendations. I don't have any more recommendations from the list right now because I don't want to take up all your time. Just want to go on through the heavy hitters. And I think without further ado, that's all I have. So thank you so much for your guys' time. And I'm happy to answer any questions. The question was on pruning. What method will get you less fruit but bigger fruit? Is it going to be pruning the apical main stem, or is it going to be pruning some of the side branches? So if you prune the top of a plant, what happened? The apical stem, that's a stem that goes straight up. When you prune that for any plant, this is basically how it works. They'll just shoot out a bunch of more side stems. So I haven't done the two pruning methods, but basically what would likely happen is you're going to get tons of branches by pruning the top stem, and likely you might get more fruit, but it might delay the fruit set. Now, if you start pruning these side branches off, what's going to happen is it's not going to promote the plant to necessarily shoot out more side branches. So you're going to have less fruit, but more nutrients going to those fruits, so they should be bigger that way. We in zone B, 5B, does that sound right? Okay. I know it changes as you go a little bit west of where I am in Ohio. So 5B, I'm pretty comfortable with strawberry. It also can depend on their siting a little bit. A big thing, honestly, cold-wise, they're fine. The big thing too, overwintering anything, this is just like a big thing on perennials. Soil conditions, they have to drain decently over the winter. If they stay too wet, it's gonna rot out no matter what it is. Yeah, sandy, be perfect. Yeah, so you'll be fine using it as a ground cover. Just make sure you choose a variety that's gonna have a lot of runners. And then you asked about sun.
Yeah, how much sun?
How much sun to give it. I generally give them as much sun as possible because the big thing with strawberries is they're highly susceptible to powdery mildew. Powdery mildew occurs a lot in shady conditions because it's an excellent environment for that fungus. The question was, does it make a difference to what type of material you use for the pot if you do container gardening? It actually can make a little bit of a difference. Generally speaking, the biggest difference is if you do a clay versus a plastic. Plastic always retains the most moisture for the longest period of time. Clay has actually pores, like micropores in it, so it'll dry out a little bit quicker. So plastic is nice for retaining the moisture longer. I use both. You're just gonna have to water one more often than the other. The question was, a lot of people are using fabric bags. What are my thoughts? I've used the fabric bags before, more for flowers than I have for vegetables. Fabric bags, oh my gosh, they dry down so quick. If you were talking about, you're talking about like the burlap or? Oh, the black. Yes, the black. The ones that can hang from walls too, vertically. Yes, those, they do tend to dry down a little bit quicker. So they work, they're functional, but you just have to monitor them more closely if you use the fabric bags. Her comment was that they do get hotter as well. Since you're basically suspending them in the air, you're exposing the roots, right, to more sunlight, so it's gonna heat up that soil way quicker than if they were on the ground. Yes. The question was, is it better to plant sweet potatoes in the fabric bags or in the ground? I would plant them in the ground more than anything. You're gonna get better yields from it in general, especially for something like a sweet potato, which is a very large plant, a plant that can take up a lot of resources, whether it's water or nutrients. Now, you could do it in a bag and it would be kind of fun because a lot of the sweet potatoes are actually kind of, I think, somewhat ornamental, to have the foliage straight down. But if you're expecting to get a great yield off of it and to rely on that for your sweet potatoes, harvest for the season, I wouldn't do it that way. Okay, her comment was that on social media, she's seen that people planting basil and tomato next to each other seem to be increasing the growth of both. I personally have not seen the research behind it. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. Without having seen the research behind it, I can't say yes or no. I would say instinctively, to me, I don't see any benefit to planting one or the other. There's not like a synergistic effect they would have nutrient-wise. Maybe there's something that has to do with, I'm not sure what they're saying the benefit is, if there's a pest that's deterring, but I've never seen a benefit to planting those together. So the question was, if you have problems with, he has problems with squash bug on his zucchini, can you use diatomaceous earth on it? Diatomaceous earth is like ground up little plankton essentially. It's like silica bits. And it gets in the gut of whatever's eating it, like an insect basically, and tears up their gut and they starve. Yes, that would work. So the big thing is that those borers on cucurbit, zucchini, whatever, the squash bugs, if you will, they also will go on the stem. The borers go on the stem, the lower stem. So putting them on the lower stem where they're gonna go have their larvae get in and get into the plant, that can help. The question was for raised bed and container gardening, what type of soil should you use? So if you go, I'm sure if you go through Wold Heights today, you'll find a lot of the bags they label nowadays for raised bed or containers. What I would not recommend using are gonna be like anything that says like soil amender or topsoil. Like those you want to use, that's your in-ground. For this, you want something that's actually been constructed for a raised bed or a container. Straight compost, I mean, I probably wouldn't plant in straight compost because it may or may not have the right drainage and it might be a little too hot. But the mixes they make nowadays are like a pretty perfect blend for those, and they'll label them on the bag. Oh, okay, the question was, despite what I said earlier, can I suggest a warm season crop for shade? So if I were gonna suggest if you only had shade, there's really nothing that I think works well in shade, but can tolerate shade is probably a better way to look at it. And if I'm gonna say something that's gonna tolerate shade, it's probably gonna be something that doesn't get powdery mildew easily, because that's what I see the most in shade. So I would have probably go with something like a compact tomato, maybe some of these cool oh, you said warm season, like a compact tomato. There might be some bush beans too that are gonna work, that can tolerate that better. But yeah, you definitely have to be careful with shade. The question was, can you go on our website and order seeds from us? So we actually, as a breeder, PanAmerican Seed, we sell through like a distributor, and then they'll sell it to a company like Wold Heights. So you can look up our varieties, you just couldn't buy them from our website. You can buy a lot of our varieties through like seed packet websites, like Johnny's or whatever, or you can buy, they carry some of our varieties here as well as live plants. All right, thank you all, and I can also stand around if you have more questions later. Thanks.